There is no proof King Arthur ever existed. No crown, no grave, no contemporary record bearing his name. That should be the end of it. In history, when the evidence runs out, the story stops, we move on, we find someone else. That did not happen with Arthur. Instead, kings went to war beneath his banner. Nations rebuilt their identity around his memory. Medieval rulers who had never heard of Rome still traced their divine right back to a man no one could prove had lived. In the 12th century, the Plantagenet dynasty used Arthurian legend as a political tool, a manufactured bloodline to legitimize conquest and silence rival claims. They used a ghost as a weapon, and the ghost worked. That is not the story of a legend. That is the story of one of the most successful pieces of propaganda in human history. So, here is the real question. Not whether Arthur existed, but why the people who built empires needed him to, and who, buried somewhere in the wreckage of Roman Britain, gave them the raw material to work with. Because someone did. Something happened in the dark centuries after Rome abandoned this island. Some battle was fought. Some leader stood at the edge of collapse and held it back, long enough for the story to survive. This is the search for that man. When Rome left Britain, it did not simply end an occupation. It removed the architecture of an entire civilization. The legions sailed away in the early 5th century and took everything with them: the supply chains, the administrative structure, the currency, the professional military. What remained were the buildings, stone forums, empty bathhouses, roads still running arrow straight across the island, with no soldiers to patrol them. The Saxons noticed immediately. They had been raiding the eastern coast for decades, probing, testing, calculating. Now there was nothing to test against. The raids became settlements. The settlements became invasions. Cities that had stood for centuries were stripped, burned, or simply abandoned as their populations scattered inland. The Romano-British population, people who had lived within the Roman world for 3 generations, who spoke Latin side by side with their native tongue, who buried their dead in Christian cemeteries with Roman coins still in the graves. They had no army, no emperor, and no plan. And then, in the fragments of one monk's furious testimony, a name appears: Ambrosius Aurelianus. The source is Gildas, a 5th century British monk whose work De Excidias and Conquestis Britannia, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, is the earliest significant account we have of this period. Gildas was not writing history in any modern sense. He was writing a sermon, a condemnation. He wanted his contemporaries to understand that Britain's suffering was divine punishment for their sins. But inside that fury, Ambrosius is treated differently. Gildas, who spares almost no one from his contempt, writes about this man with something close to reverence. He describes him as a man of noble descent, Roman stock, possibly connected to the imperial class, a Christian, and one of the only survivors of a catastrophe that had destroyed everyone around him. His parents had worn the purple, Gildas writes, the imperial color, killed in the Saxon storm. Ambrosius had nothing left except the wreckage. He built an army from it. Under his leadership, the scattered remnants of Roman Britain began to fight back. The Saxons, who had been advancing without meaningful resistance, suddenly met organized opposition. Ground was contested. Battles were won. The front line, which had been moving steadily westward, began to hold. The war went back and forth for years. Neither side could deliver a final blow. And then, at a location Gildas calls Mons Badonicus, Badon Hill, it reached a crisis point. Here is where the story gets complicated. Gildas describes the battle as a decisive one, the Britons inflicting a devastating defeat on the Saxon armies, a victory so complete it bought a generation of relative peace. He notes the battle occurred in the year of his own birth, placing it approximately around 500. He does not name the commander.
Around 470 AD, a man the Roman historian Jordanes identifies as King of the Britons crossed the English Channel with an army of thousands. His name was Rhea-Thomas. He was going to war for Rome. This needs context, because what Rhea-Thomas did in 470 AD makes no logical sense unless you understand the desperation of that moment. Britain had been outside Roman control for roughly 60 years. The empire had no authority on the island, no tax revenue from it, no troops stationed there. The connection was severed. And yet, when Rome sent an appeal across the Channel, "Come and help us, we are losing Gaul to the Visigoths," Rhea-Thomas answered. He loaded thousands of warriors onto ships. He crossed the sea. He marched into a foreign war on behalf of an empire that had already abandoned his people. Either this man was profoundly loyal to a world that no longer existed, or he had other reasons. Power, perhaps, legitimacy, the title that Rome could still, even in its death trolls, bestow on those who served it. The campaign began well enough. Rhea-Thomas joined the imperial forces and engaged the Visigoths in Gaul. For a time, it held. Then, the betrayal happened. Before the battle was decided, before Rhea-Thomas could secure a victory, the ground had already been cut beneath him. A Roman official named Arvandus had secretly opened negotiations with the Visigoth king. He had sent letters, made promises, agreed, in effect, to hand Gaul to the Visigoths in exchange for his own survival. Rhea-Thomas found out too late. His forces, unsupported, were overwhelmed. The British army was shattered. The survivors fled. And then, nothing. Rhea-Thomas vanishes from every record. No death is reported, no capture, no exile. The last location his retreat is documented near is a town in Burgundy. The town is called Avalon. Scholars have been unsettled by this for decades. The legendary King Arthur, mortally wounded at his final battle, is carried to the island of Avalon, a place beyond the mortal world, beyond history, beyond confirmation. He does not die there. He simply disappears. Rhea-Thomas, the historical king of the Britons, disappears near a real place with that name. Draw from that what you will. The structural parallels to the Arthurian legend accumulate in a way that is difficult to dismiss. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Reginum Britannium, written in the 12th century and arguably the single most influential text in the construction of Arthurian myth, describes Arthur leading a great British army across the Channel to wage war on the continent. That is exactly what Rhea-Thomas did. The betrayal of Rhea-Thomas by Arvandus
maps with uncomfortable precision onto the betrayal of Arthur by Mordred, the trusted insider who destroys the kingdom from within.
Whether Geoffrey of Monmouth knew about Riothamus, whether his sources preserved a garbled memory of the 5th century campaign, or if the parallels are coincidental, that question has never been answered. There is a further layer to this. Some historians argue that Riothamus was not a name at all, that it was a title derived from Brittonic roots, meaning something close to supreme king or highest king. If that is true, then Riothamus and Ambrosius Aurelianus may be the same man. The Romano-British warlord who fought the Saxons in Britain, also operating under a Brittonic royal title on the continent. The same person, 2 names, 2 theaters, 1 legend. The evidence for this is circumstantial, but it fits, and in the 5th century, for a leader trying to maintain authority across both Britain and the British settlements in Armorica, the region that would become Brittany, a dual identity, 1 Roman, 1 Brittonic, would be politically useful. Kings do not accidentally accumulate 2 names, they cultivate them. They understand the power of a story told the right way to the right audience. Here is something the other theories cannot fully explain. In the late 6th century, decades after Ambrosius, decades after Riothamus, a king in what is now Western Scotland named his son Arthur. Not a common name, not a Roman name, a specific, deliberate choice. That king was Aidan mac Gabhran, ruler of Dal Riata, one of the most powerful Gaelic kingdoms of early medieval Britain, and his son, Arthur mac Aidan, died young, killed in battle against the Picts, somewhere between 580 and 596 AD. He left almost no historical trace. A brief mention in the Vita Columbae, the life of Columba, written by the monk Adamnan of Iona around 700 AD, records a prophecy made by the saint that Arthur and his brothers would fall in their father's wars. The prophecy came true. On its own, this is a minor footnote, but the name is the point. Aidan mac Gabhran was not a careless man. He was a calculating, ambitious ruler who understood symbolism. He had himself ordained by Columba, the first recorded Christian ordination of a king in British history, because he understood what that legitimacy was worth. He gave his son a name that already meant something, which means that by the late 6th century, the name Arthur already carried the weight of a legend in progress. The story was already being built, already circulating, already powerful enough that a king would name his heir after it. Arthur mac Aidan is not the origin of the legend. He is evidence that the legend was already there, and that changes everything. If the name Arthur already carried mythological resonance by 580 AD, barely a lifetime after the battles of Ambrosius Aurelianus, barely a century after Riodamus disappeared near Avalon, then the transformation from history into legend was not a slow medieval drift. It was fast, deliberate, engineered. Someone in the late 5th or early 6th century began constructing the myth while the man behind it was still within living memory.
3 men, 3 fragments of a shattered age. Ambrosius Aurelianus, who held Roman Britain together by force of will and then disappeared from the record before the decisive battle was won. Riodamus, the king of the Britons, who crossed the sea to fight for a dying empire and vanished near a place called Avalon. Arthur mac Aidan, whose very name proved the legend was already circulating before the century was out. Any one of them could be the thread that was pulled into myth. But here's what the evidence actually suggests, if you look at it without the romance. The legend of Arthur was not an accident of memory. It was constructed, possibly from one man's life, possibly from several. But the construction was not random, it was purposeful, shaped by people who understood what a legendary king was worth in a world that desperately needed one. The Plantagenets understood it. They excavated what they claimed was Arthur's tomb at Glastonbury in 1191, conveniently, just as they needed to demonstrate that Arthur was dead and would not return to challenge their rule of Wales. They used the legend to close a political door. The Welsh resistance used the same legend to keep a door open. The prophecy that Arthur would return, that Britain would be reclaimed, that the Saxon conquest was not permanent. The same story, two opposite political uses, both of them deliberate. A single man can be killed, a legend cannot. That is not a coincidence. That is a design. Somewhere in the wreckage of the 5th century, a real man, possibly Ambrosius, possibly Riotimus, possibly someone whose name we have never recovered, did something extraordinary enough that people refused to let it die. Then, other people noticed how useful that refusal was, and they built a king out of it. History forgot the man. What it kept was the weapon, and the weapon is still being used. This has been Sinister Archive. I'm Ollie. We'll see you in the dark.